learn about Ideate Explorer and the Warnings Manager. So on the agenda today, what I'd like to do is give you an overview first of Ideate Explorer. And the reason I do that is because the user interface for Ideate Explorer, the way that it works, we've sort of integrated that into the Warnings Manager. So it's important to know sort of how Ideate Explorer works first before you get into the Warnings Manager to start editing and reviewing these warnings and then fixing them. So then I'm going to talk about that Warnings tab user interface. And then we're going to go through some examples of how you would fix Revit warnings. Now, I'm going to say right up front here is that, everyone wants the easy button. You push the button and the warning is fixed. So that's unfortunately not what we're doing here. What we're doing is basically enabling you to understand the warnings, right? And the elements that contain warnings, or even the types of warnings. And then you're going to use the tools in Revit to fix those warnings, right? So for instance, if, let's say as an example, in my geometric warning, I'll use the example of the floors overlap. So we're going to be able to identify where that warning occurs, what elements are causing that warning, and then you're going to use the tools in Revit, such as, for instance, to change the sketch line of the floor, let's say, so that the floors don't overlap. So it's basically giving you the management of these warnings, and then you'll use the individual Revit tools that you are so familiar with to sort of fix those. Because again, there are times where, as an example, with duplicate types, there may be situations where, that's acceptable to have a tag with duplicate types. Other times that's not acceptable, and it depends on the element and what you're working with. So we're going to talk about some of those things. Then, of course, at the very end, we'll have summary and questions. So what I'd like to do is sort of introduce you to Ideate Explorer. If you're a current customer of Ideate software, or if you're not, this is really meant for all either potential users or current users. So Ideate Explorer is a model browser. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more in depth, but it allows you to understand every single element that's in your Revit project. And so, there's a lot of text on this slide, but basically it allows you to sort of understand your Revit model and all the relationships involved in that. And the project browser is only going to give you some things that are in the Revit project. But Ideate Explorer will give you everything. And that's why I highlight here, find, refine, and revise elements, even those that are excluded from the project browser. So if you look at, Ideate Explorer is really a true model browser. It's doing something that the project browser was not intended to do. So it's showing you like I said, every instance of every element and allowing you to modify that or find things even based on parameter values if you so desire. So that's the real difference between, the sort of, some of the tools are sort of available in the project browser, but most of the elements and tools are just not available in the project browser. And so today we're going to talk about that Ideate Explorer has in its user interface a number of sort of subsections to it. You see over there on the left, we're going to talk about the Explore tab. Then there's the Navigate tab, allowing you to navigate to views, sheets, schedules, and legends. And then finally, we've introduced this third tab, Warnings, allowing you to manage the warnings. And then in addition, we also have the query tool, which is that if you look up on the right, the Ideate query allows you to search for elements based on all kinds of parameter values. So I'm going to show an example of that where maybe it's all in-place families you'd like to look for, or dimensions that have been overridden, or all doors that are 3 foot that have a metal frame. So any parameter or property that you've associated with an element, you can search, find, and filter very easily. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back, we're going to talk about the navigate and the query, but first I think I'd like to give you sort of a quick overview here. So I'm going to switch over to Revit, I'm going to make sure that that comes up on the screen here. So this it happens to be Revit 2019.1, which is the latest version from Autodesk. But as I said, we have versions available. Our latest versions are 2016, 17, 18, and 19. And so what we do is you'll notice you have your familiar architecture, structure, steel, and all the ribbons. When you load Ideate software, you'll have an Ideate software tab. And you'll see the other products that I mentioned here to the left, BIMlink, Sticky, our Ideate apps tools. That is a collection of different productivity tools. But here you'll see I have Ideate Explorer. And so when I click on Ideate Explorer, the first time I do that, this dialog comes up and it reads the elements within the view. So you'll notice here the display at the top here says active view. So in this active view, very quickly, I can see that I have 4,703 elements, and they're organized by category. Now I can switch this to the entire project. So you'll notice that I have a couple different selections here, entire project or current selection. So I'm going to say entire project. So now that number goes to 36,017. So I think the biggest thing that you'll notice here is this number associated with the category. It's sort of like the blood pressure of your project in the sense that you can quickly review that, oh, you've got 173 CAD imports, you've got, 3,555 detail items. And so, for instance, if all of a sudden you've got 3 ceilings and the next day you've got 3,000 ceilings, well, then maybe that's something you need to look at because it's giving you that count. And so if they increase drastically and you haven't been working or using those in that manner, then again, maybe that's something to review. But the way that this works is, again, it's organized by category, family, and type. So if I go to the category of curtain panels, I'm going to expand on that. I've got 786 curtain panels. You'll see that I've got operable, sliding, and system panels. And notice the numbers here. I've got 4 sliding panels and 52 operable panels. So when I expand on the operable panel, again, I have different family types, clear glazing and a pattern glazing. So if I expand one more time, this is where I get down to the level of the instance. And you notice there at the to the right, it actually says the instance here. So at any time, like I'm going to pick on this third one, I'm just going to double click. That will zoom to the element. If I tick the checkbox there, notice that it's actually highlighted in this view as well. So in this 3D view, you can see I zoom in and that element is now highlighted. And in fact, it over in the Ideate Explorer dialog, it says one selected. And it always will match what I have in my selection filter for Revit. So not only can I, choose one or two or multiple items, I can go up to the top level node, right, and select all 44 clear glazing operable instances. So notice that my selection set says 44 on my dialog. And the great thing about Ideate Explorer, and the reason I'm explaining a lot of this is that it's going to work the same for the Revit warnings, is that you can interact with the Revit model as you work. So you can keep the Ideate Explorer dialog open. So I've selected these 44. Now I can come over to the properties palette and say, well, once that's in my selection, maybe I want to change that to a sliding panel instead. So now I've modified all 44 and they are now categorized under sliding panel. And if you remember, I pointed out that there were 4 sliding panels to begin with. We just added 44. So now the total goes up to 48. And they're still selected, but now they're under the sliding panels instead. So at any point, I can always clear the selection. So that's a real quick way of selecting items and how you would, interact within the model. Now, you can also sort by not only category with Ideate Explorer, but you can come over here and say, I would like to look at elements based on their level, their phase, their work set, or who's editing them, right? Or who's currently owning that particular element. So I'll just show you one example. When I do level, notice that it's organized now by the levels in the project, top of footing, first floor, bearing, and so forth. If I go over to the top of footing, I see, well, there's a door on the top of footing. That doesn't seem right to me. So if I double click, then it's actually zooming in to that element and I can highlight there, right? And so I see that door. Now the 3D view that I have is kind of a transparent view, so it's easy to see the door, through the other elements. But sometimes that's not always the case. So again, we can use any Revit command. And one of the things I really like is once an item is selected, you can come over here to the 3D selection box, and then you can build uh, a selection box around those elements. And so you can say, oh, well, that's pretty. I can see this much easier that um, the actual door here, this barn door, is incorrectly on this top of footing level when it should have really been on level 1. So notice here, I can change it from top of footing over here in the properties palette to the first floor. And when I do that, it makes that change, it updates, and then I can come over here and turn off the section box in that 3D view. And now I have the thing or that door, again, categorized correctly. So that's just a different way of showing, sorting by these elements, right? So let's go back to category here. And I told you that, you can search for things that just don't appear within the project browser. So if I come over here to Cad Imports, that's something that's not shown in the project browser, both Cad Imports as well as Cad Links. So if I come down here to this, let's say door detail, if I double click on the first one, it can open up the view, right? Has all these details associated with it, but I have two instances of it. And so the two instances makes me kind of wonder, well, what's the second instance? So when I double click, Ideate Explorer says, hey, this element is hidden in the view. It's still there. So Explorer can know whether elements are hidden or not. And it will then say, would you like to open this view anyway and turn on the reveal hidden element? So I say, yep, that would be great. So it zooms up to that view, which is in this case a site plan view, as you see here in my tabs. And that should not be there. It's probably what happened is someone either copy pasted it and then accidentally said, okay, I don't need this anymore. Maybe right click, hide in view. So the reason it's important to understand is these CAD imports can really negatively impact the project performance. So if you have a lot of them and they're not being used or they're hidden, that's just going to be extra weight that you're carrying around in this project. So what I can do now is highlight that element, and right here from the Ideate Explorer dialog, we're giving you lots of tools to, again, audit, modify, change things. So there's an Ideate delete. And so it's telling me that, okay, you selected one CAD import. It's giving you this nice confirmation saying, yes, I would like to delete that. So I remove the CAD import. I can then turn off my reveal hidden elements and go ahead and fit the view. And now I know this site plan doesn't contain any hidden CAD imports that might be negatively impacting my project. And then at any time, I can use the search filter to say, you know what, I'd like to search for elements based on concrete. And it's going to give me things that are viewports, view references. If I go to views, for instance, I can actually decide that, oh, you know what, I want to open up a view, and I can right click and open up the sheet, which is a detail sheet that contains that view. So I can navigate to either. And what's nice is that's a good way to kind of introduce you to this navigate tool. So I'm going to clear the search. Under navigate, this is specifically showing me things that are legends, schedules, sheets, and views. So if we're looking at schedules, we're organizing them based on schedules and quantities. So I've got 2 door schedules, I've got 3 room schedules, or I'm sorry, 4 room schedules. And under schedules, I've got some Kobe compliant schedules here. So again, it's organizing it in a really nice way that the project browser, up until recently, up until Revit 2018.1, you weren't able to organize the browser organization for schedules. But again, on the way views, we say views that are either on a sheet or not on a sheet. If they are on a sheet, I can come over here to the floor plan. I can say, well, you know what, let's look at this enlarged toilet plan, double click, and then I can also, again, right click and open up the sheet that contains that, right? So if I switch back over here to navigate my presentation here, Just the reason that we added this tab was that you saw all the ways that I can explore the model. I can use the display and sort by and filter to explore things. But then the navigate gives me specifically access to views, schedules, sheets, and legends. And in this way, I can find unused sheets and views. I can find, legends or schedules by category, and I can really customize that working environment. And as I said, you'll notice up at the top there with where I have the kind of items for the project browser, this was not possible to organize schedules prior to 2018.1. So if you're using Ideate Explorer in Revit 2016 or 2017 or the first initial ship of 2018, this is a great tool to be able to organize those schedules. And it's actually a lot more flexible than the project browser. All right, the last thing kind of before we go into warnings is talking about query. Query is giving you, as I said, the ability to dig a little bit deeper and understand elements based on their parameter values. So, we can find unused annotation, or we can say, in place usage or select by revisions. So the way that this works is if I switch back over here to Revit, and let's say I want to go back to my Explore tab here, and I'm going to just select on all dimensions. So I'm going to have 1,321 dimensions selected here. Now I'm going to use my query. And so of those 1,321, what's a property I might be interested in? How about suffix? So suffix are those pieces that you've placed at the end of a dimension. So you'll notice here that it says there are 309 that are not applicable, meaning that it's probably a radial dimension. 987 are blank, but there are a number of them that do have these properties, right, that have been added to. So for instance, maybe if I come over to this verify and field, right, I can click on that and say select, and it builds the selection set of those two elements that have verify and field. So if I double click, right, and let's go ahead and look at that. Let's go to zoom fit there. Oh, get that selected here. Zoom up on that. And so there you can see that I've now selected those elements. And so there's that verify and field, right? So if I come over here and say, well, that shouldn't have been VIF, or maybe I didn't want to have that to be anything, or I wanted it to have to be something else, I can then apply that and say, okay. So if you didn't have a tool like Ideate Explorer, it would be virtually impossible to find that one dimension in thousands and thousands of dimensions that has a suffix or that's been overridden. So again, you can use this for all kinds of searches for either, like I said, parameters or property values. And we're giving you access to a lot of additional information. So as an example, let's say I come over here and go to the entire project again, right? And I'm just going to select here, let's go down to furniture items. So I'll do furniture, and I'll do that query. And another thing that we've added fairly recently is this, let's say, um, the model group information, but I also want to say, it was created by, that's what I'm looking for. So you see that it's created by. And so here, I've got my joke here that I did in this particular project. I've got George Michael and Richard Taylor. 11 elements have been created by George, and 377 elements have been created by Richard. So this gives me kind of a nice in-depth, like if I wanted to look at all the elements that George has created, I can select those and see here are the individual chairs and tables and so forth that he's created and been working on. So we also give you the last modified elements that are in the central model. So if it's been updated by a particular person, we can search on that information too. So it's pretty powerful. So let's go back here to the entire project, and I'll clear off that selection. So again, that is Ideate Query. And like I said, the reason I'm explaining all this in more detail is that all of this UI you're going to see is used in our warnings manager. Okay, so let's do that. Let's look at the user interface for warnings. So Ideate Explorer allows you to now audit your Revit warnings very easily. So it includes a very simple way to be able to rank the warnings that you have. So maybe you have 200 warnings in your project, but you want to sort of modify them based on whether they're high ranked warnings, medium, low, or maybe even hidden. And then what you can do is once you specify which ones are important to you, like let's say geometric warnings, where let's say floors overlap, that is a high ranked warning. You can now save that as a file and then load that into other projects. So someone on your team could also be using the same ranking file very easily. So a little bit about the interface here is that you'll notice that I'm using, again, the same information that I had before with the user interface. We have the display, we have the sort by, the filter, and then we're giving you sort of this little dialogue window into what the warnings are, right? And then information down below about the particular element that you're selecting on. So if I switch to Ideate Explorer again, right? So one of the things I didn't explain just with the normal Explore tab, I talked about the display, the entire project, how I can sort by different elements, but there's also this filter where I can easily filter on any Revit created filter, right? Or any custom filter, or we've actually supplied some that are by default. So if I say Ideate Audit, it's going to kind of give me a smaller list of elements that I should be looking at to audit. And for instance, lines is a good one. I've got 17,592 lines. This is information the project browser is not going to show you. You can go to detail lines here and you can quickly see that there are some that don't match your company standards. So I can select on these detail lines very easily, just like you saw me do with other elements. And I can work interactively and say, you know what, I would like to now change all those lines to the A detail, let's say fine. So now I've moved 487 lines to have the A detail fine standard, and the other ones are no longer listed because there are no instances that have that particular line style. So they could be purged out. So again, that's a great way to use the filter. And the reason I explain that is let's now look at our next tab. So we talked about explore, navigate. Now we're on to the warnings. So now when I highlight warnings, notice the display by default is warnings. I can sort by the type of warning. So in this case, these are probably familiar to you. Highlighted floors overlap, highlighted walls overlap, elements have duplicate values. These are, again, kind of common warnings. But I want to switch from types to elements. And so this is telling me, okay, which element, right? So in this case, this roof instance has 18 warnings on it. And so you see what it is here. And in fact, I can, double click to zoom into that, and you can see over here in my canvas window, it's highlighted that for me. So I know exactly which particular roof is now having 18 warnings associated with it. And all of them are the highlighted walls are attached but miss the target. Sometimes in certain cases, like with this, there are more than one warning. Like in this case with this interior 7¼ inch partition, we have a highlighted wall overlap, but we also have a wall and a room separation line overlap. So, it's nice to be able to switch to sort by elements or types. And then again, filter allows me to filter by high, medium, or low. So how do you rank these? So let's say that one of the things I'm really concerned about is that there are the highlighted floors overlap. It's a geometric warning. So if I right click on this, let's say go over here and say that I want to now set that ranking. So right now it is set to medium. I can specify that I want it to be either not ranked or I want it to be high. If I select high, what it does is it gives me an alert icon, knowing that even if I'm not in the warnings tab, this alert icon up here under display entire project or active view shows me that I have warnings, that at least I have one that is a high ranked warning. And notice that when I switch to warnings, this highlighted floors overlap came to the top because it's organized based on high, medium, and low. So for instance, if I change this tag is outside of its coordinates here, and I say, well, you know what, that is actually going to be, let's say, oops, let's go over here, sorry. I want to set the ranking to be low. And then if I refresh the list, it actually puts that down below in the list. So it's, again, always organized, and I can use the refresh here if it doesn't automatically refresh on high, medium, or low. So I can interact with that. Then, again, I can search for particular elements, but I can say filter, just show me the high ranked warnings as an example. So I filter on that. I can come over here and expand this warning, and it consists of two elements, a 6-inch concrete instance of the floor and an 8-inch concrete instance. And you can actually see there they're highlighting, and if I can zoom on that, it's going to specify where those, or highlight where those are. Now, it may be a little bit difficult if I come over here to, let's go down here to my audit view. And so there you can see it a little bit more that I'm highlighting it in this blue. So one's the overall floor slab, one's this other concrete floor slab that's located here. And again, what's nice about this is that if I take these two, I'm going to do the shift. So I'm going to, with the keyboard, highlight on those two. And then I can say, you know what, I would like to, I've got two selected. I'm going to come over here to my icon that allows me to hide or isolate elements, and I can isolate those two elements. So I'm only showing those elements. So and I'm going to show you an example of that too as well. So again, with any command or element you select, you can use other Revit commands. So if I come back over here, oops, not reveal hidden elements, sorry about that. And then I can reset that, yes. So let's go reset my temporary hide isolate, and let's cancel that. So now I'm back to looking at everything in my 3D view. So that's just a little bit about the user interface, allowing you to understand, the warnings very easily. Okay, so that's why, like I said, I spent a lot of time at the beginning talking about the Ideate Explorer interface, because the warnings are going to use those same features of display, sort by, filter, search, and the results tree. And then, as I mentioned, there is the settings menu. The settings menu accesses the default rankings file. So what we're very proud of with Ideate software is no matter what solution you're using, whether it's our BIM Link solution or our Ideate Explorer, our renumbering tools under Ideate apps, we're giving you a lot of information to start with. We're not saying you have to create all this. So we've actually created a default rankings file where we have ranked warnings based on the calculated geometric warnings and common warnings example. We kind of basically given it a first pass, right? So if this is your very first time in a project and you call up Ideate Explorer, this is the default ranking file that's going to be used. Once you modify the rankings file, then you have the ability to export, which is really just saving it, or importing it, or loading a file in. So this could be that you want to transfer you modified all your settings and now you want to transfer it to a different project. And once you have that, let's say you've modified all the rankings, you can basically place it in the default rankings library path so that every new project that is using Ideate Explorer would pull that up and use that default rankings file. All right, so this is a good kind of pause point to say, okay, why is this important? Why do we care about Revit warnings, and why do we have this user interface? Well, the reason being is that these Revit warnings can start to pile up in your project, right? As you start to work, you get a little warning that says, hey, there are identical instances, or maybe, like I said, floors overlap, geometric warnings, or maybe there's a, something with an MEP file, there's not, the calculations aren't correct or the systems aren't connected. And many times you can just ignore and keep working. But as you ignore and you keep piling these Revit warnings up, they can start to really impact the project performance. And in fact, if you look at the Revit help file, and we've done a lot of looking at as far as what is Autodesk saying about these warnings, the default Revit help file says that it's important to review these warnings on a regular basis and fix them because they can have a very serious impact on the performance. And in fact, as you see there, what I bolded, over time, the presence of warnings could result in poor performance, slow synchronization times because it's having to like figure out the calculations, or it's not having all the numbers right for the calculations. It can have incorrect schedule data, especially when you've got duplicated instances or errors when it comes to like tagging, and then potentially, if, depending on the error, even file corruption. So it's incredibly important to have a system where you can interact and review these Revit warnings on a regular basis. Okay, so what we've identified, and this is actually part of the Revit sort of help system as well, is that there are three major classifications of Revit warnings. So there are common Revit warnings, things like duplicated instances, as I said, maybe you've got two pieces of furniture on top of one another, which is going to cause an incorrect schedule count. So that could be really important to understand. Then you've got duplicate marks, which may or may not be that important. Sometimes with Kobe standards, you're not supposed to have any duplicate marks. Other times it's acceptable. So, you can choose to basically decide if that's a warning you want to tackle. Then there are calculated warnings, and in my example, I'm going to show no loss defined, but there are many, many types of warnings that they're trying to calculate things in the Revit model. And if the data is not there, when it comes to either the systems or maybe like I said, the top of the wall is not intersecting with the roof and so forth, some of those calculated ones are very problematic. And then that leads to geometric warnings, where I gave you an example of the floors overlap, but join geometry is a couple examples where this could be impacted. So what I'm going to do is talk about why this interface is important. Well, there is a uh, a interface for reviewing warnings in Revit, and that's what you see on the right there. But this warnings interface basically just gives you kind of limited data about the element, and you have to close that dialog and then fix the warning. There's no way to keep that dialog open and work and then fix the warning with the default Revit warning dialog. So that's where Ideate Explorer comes into play and makes it a lot easier. So again, what are the consequences of not fixing these warnings? So I'm going to use, this is the first one I'm going to look at, is identical instances. So again, you've got two pieces of data on top of one another. So maybe it's like, two structural columns or two pieces of furniture. Well, again, this can cause model inaccuracy. There can be potential errors in the field when it comes to scheduling. So it's important to understand this. So let's take a look at that. So again, we have our Ideate Explorer interface, and you'll notice that this warning, I've got 11 elements, or I should say 11 warnings, where it says that there are identical instances. So it's important to review the data. So when I look at this, I've got this 6-inch diameter, and I've got information about that, kind of a quick information. Here's my little joke, that was created by George Michael. And now if I look at the other element, you'll notice that the Kobe data has not been filled out in the properties palette. So it's important to review these elements, because just because you have two doesn't necessarily mean that, though, the second one is the one you should delete, because maybe the second one has the detail filled out on it. In this particular case, that first element, the 60-inch diameter instance, has all the Kobe data. That's the correct one. The second one that was created by George is the one that is the problem and can be deleted. So now I go ahead and delete that, and you'll notice now the warnings are reduced to 10. So we went from the different types of warnings. Now as you saw, I can switch to elements, and I can see all of the furniture elements that have warnings associated with them. And again, because I can work interactively in the model, I can highlight all of those chairs and look at this as isolate those elements, and then do a section box around them, like I did for the um, the door earlier, and see exactly what I'm dealing with. And then I can decide, well, are these, are these duplicates, or what is the, or which one is the correct one to remove, let's say, to remove that warning. So it's giving you all those tools to be able to interact with that. So here's another one that I mentioned as a common warning, where you've got duplicate marks. And again, sometimes this is okay, meaning that, let's say you have a structural element and maybe you don't want to have marks on it, or tags. Other times it's important because, per the COBie deliverable, if you're using that COBie requirements, it requires that they be unique instances, or unique numbers, or pieces of information about that. So if I look at this particular warning, let's look at our Ideate Explorer. And so I'm going to switch again to the warnings tab here. And you'll notice that I have, I've kind of, I truncated it a little bit, where I've just got these marks that I've got, 18, 33, and 288 elements that have duplicate marks. So a quick way to fix that is actually select all 288, right? And just go to the mark value in the properties palette and basically, hit the space bar and say apply. And then when I refresh, all 288 of those, I don't get any duplicate marks. So that's one way of handling it. Now, that may not be correct, right? Maybe you need a mark. So in this case, now I'm going through this warning, and all these are B3. So that's why I'm getting that duplicate mark warning. So what I want to do is change it to B3-1, B3-2, and it's still, at each time that I change it, it's still saying that there are others that have duplicate mark values. That's the sort of the Revit warning. So as I change this to now B3-2, it's saying, okay, great, you've modified that one, but there are others that have duplicate mark values. So this is where I would have to go through and identify each one of those one at a time to change the mark values. And so now that I've changed those mark values for those two, 20, the B1, B2, refreshed it, it went from 33 warnings down to 31 warnings. So again, multiple ways to be able to handle this. Now, another warning, as I mentioned, are calculated warnings. So my example here is going to be where in an MEP system, there has been the warning, which is no loss or no friction loss for this particular system. So there is a specific coefficient. Now, if you're not defining these things, it can be inaccurate calculations and potential liability and incorrect modeling. So here we have Ideate Explorer, and we're in an MEP file, right? And so then I'm going to switch over to the warnings tab, and you'll notice that one of the warnings is no loss defined. So again, as you saw with any of the elements, I can look at this 45-degree instance. I can double click to zoom right to the element within the model or canvas. And you notice that the loss method is set to coefficient. And again, here I'm using the 3D selection box to really kind of zoom into this and understand where this element is. So, the loss method is the coefficient from ASHRAE, but the ASHRAE is not defined. So there's no basically catalog for this. So what I'm going to do is actually specify a particular loss. So in this case, instead of pulling it from ASHRAE, I'm going to say the coefficient is 0.45, say OK. And now that warning has been solved, if you want to call that, or removed. So now it went from 162 down to 161. So again, if I wanted to go through and have these 76 warnings modified, I would go through and change the either by specifying a specific coefficient or making sure that the ASHRAE catalog was correctly identified. And then there's these geometric warnings. This is a good one where I said this earlier, the floor overlap. This could cause, inaccurate quantity takeoff, It could cause unintended consequences in the 3D views. Maybe the elements might get hosted to the wrong floor. So it's important to understand this. So just like I did earlier, you can go over here and you can select on the warnings. You see that I've got this, the warnings here, the highlighted floors overlap. Here's where I'm going to look at that, and I'm actually going to change the ranking. So, if I made it high ranking, you'll see then by refreshing the list, it's going to appear at the top. And the two elements are those two walls, or I'm sorry, two floor slabs that I mentioned earlier. And so I'm going to select on both of them. And once I select on both of them, then I can go over to the isolate tab and say isolate those elements. So it just is an easier way for me to see. Then using the command in Revit, I'm just going to look at the one floor slab, edit the boundary so the boundary is not overlapping with the other floor boundary there, and go ahead and fix that and say that's good. And now that warning has gone away. So it's not shown anymore, and then I can reset the temporary hide isolate back to my full view. So it's again, nice for me to be able to identify those items or isolate those items while I'm fixing the warning. And then lastly, I've got this example of what I call bad modeling. And it's basically things that maybe they don't intersect, or the model's not working correctly. It could be unintended display in the 3D views again, could impact the quantity takeoff. And in some cases, like you see the example here, these two structural elements, maybe there is a separation or a gap between those two elements. And this is a warning that's okay. Or maybe it's something that needs to be dealt with. So that's the nice thing, is that you can look at this and say, okay, the highlighted elements are joined, right? But they're not intersecting. So here I'm highlighting those two, but it's hard to see again in this view, where those elements are. So again, I'm going to select the two elements. I'm going to use the isolate to isolate those elements that I've just selected. And then I'm also going to go to a top view, because it's a little bit easier for me to see how those elements are intersecting. And like I said, this may be a condition that's acceptable, right? Because I want to have an expansion joint. Uh, but maybe there are other times where no, this was incorrect. These two elements should be intersecting. So I'm just going to pull the second structural member up so that it does intersect with the first structural member. And now, again, that warning is removed. And so I've reviewed that, and I say, okay, great. And let's go ahead and say that, okay, refresh that list to see those warnings. Now, another important thing here is if I switch back over, I just wanted to show you also when I was talking about the warnings, right? So if I say, let's look at the filter here. If there is a warning, as an example, line and sketch is slightly off axis, maybe I'm not concerned with that particular warning. I can right click and I can hide it. So it's not showing up in my list anymore. I'm not having to worry about it. But I can always come back to the filter and say, show me the warnings that I've hidden. And then it'll show me that, okay, now I've got the 96 where the line in sketch is slightly off axis. So like I said, it's a determination that you need to make whether you should fix that particular element or not, or whether it's critical or not. And so if it's something where you say, no, this is fine, it's not really a warning, even though Revit's telling me, I can go ahead and hide that warning pretty easily.